So right now it's 5 o'clock, so maybe we can start, and if other PhD students will join us, then it's also fine, because they can of course apply whenever they want and come into this virtual classroom or virtual workshop. So I will just say a few words. As you have already seen in conference program of our Dubrovnik International meeting. So this year we have one pre-conference event, and I am really happy that I can introduce to all of you our distinguished guest, Professor Daniel Hjorth from Copenhagen Business School from Denmark. Who is of course going to speak to you about how to publish in of course your scientific papers in a very good journals. He serves as a senior editor or editor-in-chief in different journals, especially with the impact factor. But of course, he is going to say more about himself, and of course to introduce to all of you this workshop more in details. Once again, Daniel, thank you very much for coming to this virtual classroom. I'm really sorry that you couldn't come to Dubrovnik, but I hope that in the future we will have again an opportunity to cooperate and to host you at the University of Dubrovnik.
Thank you very much, Ivona, and thank you all for being here. Some new ones come in, which is wonderful to see. And thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to do this. I am addressing the conference tomorrow in one of the keynote speeches tomorrow morning. But this is an excellent warm-up, of course, and I too would have preferred to be in Dubrovnik, that I have, of course, visited before, and it's a lovely city, it's a lovely place to be in. Especially this time of the year, before it gets too hot. From a Scandinavian perspective, it's a city with history and location, and of course with wonderful people. That is the bulk of any good city. So that's a pity, but it's partly related to the challenges we are hopefully leaving behind with a pandemic time that complicated travels and makes travel options less frequent. So there were cancellations and movements involved, and it made it in the end possible. We are facing, of course, in the coming days also the EGOS conference, which is the biggest on the European side business school conference this year in Amsterdam, but not really. It is fully virtual too. This is a bit hybrid that we are doing here, but so I will introduce myself a bit and explain why EGOS is a big commitment. As Ivona said, I'm at Copenhagen Business School, or CBS that we say, but also a part-time at Nottingham Business School in the UK, and adjunct professor at Kyoto Graduate School of Management in Japan. So it's a busy time. But for you, it might be important to know that Copenhagen Business School is slightly different apart from it being a rather large school. It's 23,000 students and 700 faculty. We also have slightly unusual departments. So where I am located is the Department of Management, Politics and Philosophy. And that sounds like a little peripheral entity, but it's the biggest department at CBS. So we are 130 scholars at that department, mainly focusing, as the name says, on business, on politics, philosophy, but also on history. And now, since a year or so, we also have the law people in our department. So it's a genuinely multidisciplinary department, paradigmatic plurality and international focus. and that's an important backdrop to what I will be talking about here too. The other important element in the background is my role as editor-in-chief for organization studies. So I've served organization studies for a number of years. Before editor-in-chief, also being senior editor, as Ivona also mentioned, and apart from that, reviewing for a number of journals. I will show you a bit about that, talk a bit more about that in a moment. But it is from that editorial position that I will speak in the experience of having reviewed a lot and edited a lot. Of course, also edited books for publishers, but primarily journal publishing is in focus here, of course. Organization studies is a busy journal. We have more than 950 submissions per year, so it's a busy job to be an editor-in-chief. We have a double function in the journal because of the size. So Renate Meyer is co-editor-in-chief together with me, and we have a 4-year term. So I'm actually concluding. I'm finishing my 4 years in September this year. So it's my last semester, so to speak. And this journal, Organization Studies, is part of EGOS, and therefore I mentioned EGOS in the opening, the European Group of Organizational Studies. And that's a large network of people, 3,500 members, but the conferences typically gather some 2,200 to 500 people. And the journal was started by the EGOS community 42 years ago. So we had a 40-year anniversary not too long ago in 2019. For that reason, the upcoming EGOS conference includes a lot of things for me as an editor, but also, of course, as a scholar like you or a researcher like you, with presenting and hosting and convening stuff. So today the agenda is to talk about publishing and learn more about publishing. And I will use, it would be foolish not to, I will use the perspective of having edited and reviewed, and primarily organization studies. Organization studies is a broad journal that publishes a very broad range of topics, but of course has as a particular focus organizational research. And we will also try to figure out what that means in terms of someone submitting to a journal, the aims and scope of the journal, and the fit that often is used as an argument for whether the paper submitted is for that journal or not. And then we will focus a bit more on what is typically the problem or the main challenge for rejected papers, i.e. to make a theoretical contribution or conceptual contribution in a convincing way. So we will talk a bit more about how to understand such a contribution, what it is to make a theoretical contribution, what concepts are, how they should be understood, and how to clearly and convincingly develop such a contribution in your paper. Doing so, of course, reduces the risk of being rejected, and it is the key target for any one submitting, of course, to get a revise and resubmit decision from the senior editor. We will talk about how that is achieved. But the key success factor here is to make a strong contribution. So we will head into that and then finish a bit with examples of good and bad writing in terms of setting up the paper, in terms of structure and abstract writing and so on and so forth. So I hope you leave this session, this workshop, with a greater sense of what needs to be done when you write, and by implication, a greater chance of submitting a well-crafted paper, and therefore be published. So we will, of course, open for questions and discussions towards the end. So that would be an opportunity for interacting, and maybe I can help. Sorry, maybe I can ask Ivona to help me keep track a bit if people write in the chat or if they use hand raising functions and so on, so I don't miss any questions at that point, but we will come to that. So the first challenge is to share a screen and see if that works well. So does that look all right?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Yeah, so I focus on organization studies. It will be our case. We will use organization studies as a case for publishing in top-ranked journals. So we just received our impact factor yesterday, actually, for the year 2020, and organization studies now has an impact factor of 6.306. So the level of accuracy in those calculations is a bit weird, of course, but it's just a mathematical effect of how they calculate it. They've decided that three decimals is an okay accuracy. And we are happy for that. It has bumped up every year during my editorship, and Renate and I need to keep an eye on the impact factor without being driven by the impact factor. We have a very broad discussion about this with the EGOS community and the EGOS board, as well as with Sage, who is our publishers, that we primarily want to of course, have organization studies being an interesting and intellectually stimulating journal to read, and therefore attractive to publish in. And that should be, of course, the driver of any measure of success, where the impact factor has become the norm today. It's the standard, of course, when you look into where to publish. This means several things, but there are alternatives. We have, for example, the Financial Times that lists top journals, the 50 top journals nowadays in the field of management and business, where organization studies is also included. So being in, as it's is usually expressed, being a FT top 50 journal is also important. And it is important also, if one believes, as we do, that we publish critical, multidisciplinary, innovative research. There might be not that many outlets for that, and therefore it's important to keep the journal in the top lists, because you all know that applying for a job, of course, means competing with other people and their publications, therefore, having published in an FT50 top listed journal, or a journal with a good impact factor, matters. So that's the balance, you could say, to keep the journal creative, innovative, and a bit quirky, and still remain on the top lists. That's our responsibility, of course, as editors. But as I mentioned, I've been senior editor of organization studies several years before being asked to become editor-in-chief, but also on the editorial review board of several other journals like Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, Organization, National Small Business Journal, and so on. And from that, you can see that historically I have one leg in entrepreneurship studies and one leg in organization studies. It has become more organization studies lately, but I'm still fascinated by how organizations are created, how organizations achieve being, as will be part of my keynote address tomorrow. And there's no better empirical basis for figuring out how that is done than to study entrepreneurial ventures, of course, or the creation of new firms. So I think that's a very interesting conversation to be in between entrepreneurship and organization studies. So yeah, so 40 plus year old journal, and one that publishes peer-reviewed top quality theoretical and empirical research. The focus for us, and this is the aim and scope formulations of the journal, is we say we focus on organizations, organizing, and the organized in and between societies. And the in and between societies is our way to say that we emphasize contextual work. We do not publish work that is study of a business as if it was anywhere, meaning nowhere in the world. We do want to see organizations being contextually located in the time, place, culture, and sociality where it is found. We find that to be an important element of anchoring research in society. We see research as an important part of society, of changing and challenging, diagnosing, developing society. So what we call ad hoc theorizing in that sense, or ad hoc research that is sort of disconnected from society, is not for us. That could be for other journals. It is global also in this respect, that we do publish papers from all over the world and want to be more global than we are. Which is a bit of a challenge if you have a European, primarily UK, Scandinavia, and nowadays US, Canada, and Australia dominated journal. Germany is also big, but it has a European heart, of course, with a global mindset, so to speak, and outreach. Other important key elements from aims and scope formulations that are important to understand in any case of submitting your research. This is rooted in social sciences: diversity, comparative, paradigmatic plurality. That signals what kind of research the journal is looking for. And it is indeed an important element of becoming published, to read, study a bit the aims and scope of the journal that you submit to, in order for the paper not to be rejectable on those grounds. So we get many papers to our journal that studies. They study leadership, for example, and they make a contribution to leadership theory, leadership research. And if that is without any relationship to organization theory, it is not for our journal. there are you can study management of A and B and X, and if it is just a study of how to better manage something, that's a management journal paper. So it has to relate to the work organization or the organizational context in which those managing practices are conducted, and have some implications for organization theory. So there are, or if it is a paper on entrepreneurship, it might be ideas of how to become an entrepreneur again, or how to fund your startup, or how to convince venture capitalists and so on. And again, if there is no organizational problem involved in that, it falls outside the scope of our journal. So it's important to think about that. Otherwise, there will be an easy decision for an editor involved to say this falls outside the domain of the journal. And as you know, it's a very competitive game. I think presently 6 to 7% of everything that is submitted to our journal gets published. So one needs to be inside that little piece of the cake, obviously. So what we say typically, and this goes for all journals, it's in no sense and no way unique to organization studies. It's important that the paper makes a theoretical contribution. And of course, no one sits with a correct answer to the question, where's the boundary for organization studies? Where does it start and stop? But there are, of course, questions that relate to organizations, organizing and the organized, and problems in and around that that is easy enough to relate to in the problematization of your work. So one can, once again, not limit the study to management, to entrepreneurship, to leadership, to marketing. It has to have an element of making a contribution to organization studies. Of course, there are many sort of jobbing papers, a paper that nothing is incorrect or wrong, perhaps not particularly weak, but it's not exciting to read. It doesn't engage the reader. It doesn't find a way to speak to the reader. And this element, it's difficult to put the finger on what it is. It's a question of style and address, a tone, the use of language. But in the competition, it matters. Of course, a paper will never be rejected on the basis of it was boring to read. I'm sorry, but you will find that reviewers, there are 3 reviewers on each paper in our journal and in most top journals. These 3 reviewers and or the editor will often ask the author or authors to find a way to pull in the reader, attract the reader. Why should they read this paper? Why after half a page should they go on to the next page? And why after 3 pages should they read all 28 pages? This is just a way to think about how to give your own reasoning, your own discussion, your own contribution a better chance to go across the pages and into the reading mind of the reader. We do cherish the critical, the subversive, the playful. We often say it is a bit of a quirky journal. We have a particular genre of or article type we call X and OS. X being the unknown or the yet not too well studied, slightly peripheral, marginal topic. And you find and they are essays, they are essay style papers. So we are also for a broadening of the format of writing, not converging as happens today on the typical article research paper format, but wants to bring new life to the essay and also to books. Of course, we are not publishing books, but we are publishing book reviews continuously. So we do find this to be important. And of course, it is a bit more for the essay to be playful and subversive or provocative even. But one can learn from those in terms of style and style consciousness for a normal research paper. You find X and OS essay publications on stranger topics like color and organization studies, or the night and organization studies, or construction cranes and organization studies. And you would be surprised how much one can learn from those topics. And of course, reflexivity, when we talk about that, is a lot about what is assumed by the author, and being aware of that is a key element of critical thinking. Since the dawn of systematized thinking, of course, but primarily since Immanuel Kant and his three critiques and renewal of that. And then there are a number of waves, of course, of critical work, some being based in historical materialism and Marxism, some being based in studies of power and domination, often Foucauldian such, and some being postmodern and playful, and nowadays often process-oriented or practice-oriented. All of these are often exercising forms of critical thinking in terms of being careful about what is assumed when something is argued or reasoned, because motivating a study, which is a key element of the opening of a paper, often involves that kind of argument, saying that to date, the study of the organization of change has assumed X and Y, or have taken for granted that this and that is the case. And this paper wants to question that, and do so by introducing something. And the assumption at play in that sort of intellectual move needs also to be open for scrutiny, of course. So that kind of reflexivity is a key element of critical thinking in terms of including one's own thought in what is critiqued. So we, as I mentioned, in and between society in our aims and scope formulation signals that we do contextualize organizations to be in society. So it needs to reflect, as is the case now. Many papers do problematize a pandemic time. So the implications for work organization in pandemic times means new forms of isolation. So an individualization. People sit like I do here in home, rather than being amongst all of you people in a room. which again would have been more fun. But what does that mean in terms of how we communicate, how we organize, and how we make sense? And of course, that has to be, if you study anything of that kind, that has to show in your paper, and not pretend that your paper is decontextually located in a nowhere. That it dares to know is related to this sapere aude, of course, again back to Immanuel Kant if you want, but the dare to know is, of course, that we do welcome the creative spin or tweak in our papers. We do cherish reader feedback that says that organization studies is an interesting journal to read. It's not only a place where you want to publish. And especially I often get from PhD students that they do read organization studies for inspiration and for being intellectually challenged and renewed. And I think that's a beautiful sort of review as such of the journal. And I think daring to know is part of that. Methodologically conscious, so method discussions in papers are also becoming more and more sort of a have-to part of the paper, where you diligently report on the data, and that's it. And here again, we also want a bit more reflexivity to enter. So apart from answering the question, how was data generated, which is the key question for method, there is always a methodology. There's always a theoretical and philosophical context for method choices. Method often involves a number of techniques for generating data, such as interviewing, but why that makes sense is often a question of the methodology that provides the basis for method choices, and also the analytical strategy applied. So if you have generated data via interviews, for example, how do you plan to analyze those? Well, of course, excuse me, by making use of your theoretical framework, but you can still analyze the data from a discourse analytical perspective, from a narrative perspective, from a classical hermeneutic interpretivist perspective, and so on. So you can still work with that data from various analytical strategies, and that's important, of course, because it should be related to the problem and the purpose of the study. So the analytical strategy should support your possibility of fulfilling the purpose with the study, which has to be to tackle the research problem, the question, but of course do that in hopefully a new way, or in a way that enables you to develop a new contribution. So what does it look like? Many of you might have submitted, of course, and perhaps some have submitted to organization studies too, and the process is not too different in most journals, even if it varies. So Sofia Zagaraki is the managing editor of the journal, and she's the first you bump into when you submit. She's the one that receives, registers the paper, and so on. Then it goes to one of the editors-in-chief, so Renate Meyer or me. And come September this year, it will be Paolo Quattrone, who will replace me on the job of co-editor-in-chief together with Renate. And then there is 2 years overlap, and then after 2 years, Renate moves out, and a new co-editor-in-chief comes in. So there's a 4-year term, 2-year overlap model. But we have then 30 plus senior editors. that we work with. So that means that about 63% of all the submissions are desk rejected by Renate and me. And if they are not, they are passed on in most cases. Very few cases we do keep the papers ourselves as senior editors or editors handling the review process. But in most cases, we pass it on to one of the experts on that paper's topic. Yeah? So if you're studying legitimacy and reputation, it might go to Bernard Forge. If you study philosophy of something, it might go to one of the people working with that. If it is strategy, it might be Martin Kornberger. If it is critical theory, it might be Peter Fleming. If it's affect or emotions, it might be Mariana Fotaki, and so on and so forth. Innovation, design, Silvia Svejenova. So a fantastic group, of course, of senior editors that then are, as I said, expert on that particular field. And they, by being experts, they do check the paper too. So an additional 10% or so are rejected by senior editors who, although I might have suggested to Peter Fleming that this looks interesting and see whether this can be taken on, and he reads it and says, no, this is, it doesn't quite, or that there's some fundamental problem here in their method that I can't really get my head around, or so there are a few occasions where this happens too. But if it doesn't, they do invite 3 reviewers to the paper, and then again the reviewers can reject the paper. Yeah. So you have 3 reviewers, and of course if 2 says reject and 1 says a major revision, in this case, if we imagine Peter is handling it, he would probably say this is a reject. You need a stronger reason to engage those 3 reviewers again than 2 thumbs down and 1 perhaps. Yeah. So this is then becomes your target. When you submit, you want to reach the senior editors who says, yeah, this should be taken into review, it looks interesting, and then not give reviewers on that topic in the field of what you have written a good reason to say this is not aware of what has been going on, or this is a weird argument, or I can't really understand how they have used the data, or this is announced as a discourse analysis, but there's nothing about discourse in the end, and so on and so forth. So this is, of course, a way to think from the perspective of those who will be your first readers, i.e. the editors and the reviewers, to not give them a good reason to reject it. So the editorial review board includes some 175 people. On each paper, there is at least 1 from the editorial review board reviewing your paper. That's the policy we have. It's not a law, but we want, of course, to engage people on the editorial review board, because these are so good reviewers that they have been invited to the editorial review board. And in the reviewer database, there are more than 4,500 people that reviews for the journal, and all of you are happy to do so too. It's an excellent way to learn how to write a better paper, to review other people's work, of course. And believe me, you learn a lot from doing so. And this is, of course, central to what it is to become an academic. Yeah? So let's not forget, in this competitive publish or perish foolishness of today's academic world, that it's a sharing economy fundamentally from the start. Ideas should travel, and travel quickly, and they need to be dialogically furnished, developed and polished. So one needs to engage in such, this is just stats, and it's difficult to really get your head around, but presently 951 papers or so original. The left column is coming to the journal, so it's a big job. So this only says that the handling times have gone down, which is more important for me, and so now 46 days, and perhaps even more important is that the average review time is now 37 days, and it's around there. We are pressing that, of course, but it's around there still, I think, today, 35 days or so. So it's a fairly comparatively quick process. And that's important, of course. You don't want your paper to be stuck in a review process, or where you don't know yes or no. Or but the problem here is, as you can see on the left side, that we ask 5.3 reviewers for each paper, meaning before you get 3 that says yes on a paper, the full review process don't start. Of course, we want 3 reviewers in. Sometimes 3 do say yes, and then 1 drops out, and then you have to, if you're not too far into the process, you want to replace that one, and you need to ask again for reviewers. So that complicates. The ideal world is, of course, that you always get a yes from the first 3 you ask, and then they stay with the paper until the end. And unfortunately, that's seldom the case. So that's the life of being an editor too, is to really remind people, invite people, and push the process forward. And as you see, closer to 3 review rounds before a paper is published, 2.85. So you get a major revision typically, then you get a minor revision ideally, and then you get another minor revision, or a conditional accept with revision. So your paper will do 3 revisions typically before it's published. So as you know, this is a tedious process. It could, typically more than 2 years, but it is, of course, rewarding to be there. And today we have author-accepted manuscripts, so you don't need to be waiting for being printed in an issue. As soon as your paper has been accepted for publication, it is brought back to you, and you can author accept a manuscript for digital publication. So it will be available on the journal's webpage, and that can be a year before it ends up in a printed copy of the or in an official issue. We actually do, not many people do want to have printed copies these years, but every paper is, of course, assigned a volume and an issue, and we publish 12 issues per year. 3 of those are special issues, so you of course need to be given a formal place. So if we look into the review process, you see well, that it is developmental. We even rejection letters are developmental letters, in the sense that we insist on everyone learning something from the paper. from the decision letter. So if you do get a reject, you will still have a good sense of why it is rejected, of course, but also what could be done for the paper to develop. Of course, if you get a reject, as with any other good journal, you cannot submit it again, the same paper. You have to go to another journal. There are rare occasions where we have reject and resubmit, and that's on the basis of one aspect of the paper being preventing it from being taken into review. So if there is some flaw or something missing, or that the editor thinks is possible to fix, so to speak, you can get an opportunity to revise it and resubmit it again. Typically, rejects are on insufficient contribution. Of course, there are many reasons for why a paper is poor, but we mentioned before that method or lack of fit are two others, but contribution, theoretical, making a strong theoretical contribution is often the case. Revising and resubmitting is often for developing the framing better, so the analysis can strengthen the contribution. They are, of course, intimately related. It can be that the contribution is weak, unnecessarily weak. There is more to say, there's more to do. So the reviewers urge the author to do more. And if that is prevented by the lack of data, it becomes often a bit more complicated process. Either you consider to complement the data with new data, often takes time, or you design the expectations for the reader, saying that the data is used here to indicate or to demonstrate, but primarily enables us to make a conceptual contribution by developing theory, where the data is more illustrative or indicative of a problem, and not so much based on the empirical. And of course, that's also possible. So you submit your paper when you have tested it, when it has been read by other eyes. It's important that it doesn't leave your desk as a product that has only seen you as the reader. So writers need to make use of conferences, workshops, and colleagues, and that will always strengthen the paper. As you know, you often get surprised by the reviewers' comments that they did not read the paper as you intended to. And this is, of course, the thing with reviewing and with opening up the paper to the world, so to speak. So internal seminars are important for this, work in progress seminars, but also conferences and workshops where you have a chance to present, because you force yourself, of course, to be clearer and more precise and more engaging when you know others will read. It has to fit the aim and scope, of course. It has to be aware of what has been published in the field on your topic, but also in the journal. It's not at all a requirement to refer to stuff in the journal, but you can imagine how irritated it would be if you submit a paper on a topic for which there has been a special issue in organization studies 3 years ago, and you show no sign of awareness of that. And the special issue is, of course, also a process where highly competitive, we might get 80 submissions to a special issue. We can publish 6 papers. So in the published issue is, of course, 6 top quality papers on that topic. And if you haven't even bothered to look into the journal you submit to and see what has been published before on my topic, it looks bad, simply. And of course, it also will prevent you from making a contribution, because often you repeat or you develop something where others have said this and that about similar results. And showing ignorance of that, of course, will also be a major problem for the journal. And of course, there's some sense of saturation in terms of quality. I can't move this longer. I can't push it anymore. So then it's time to submit, of course. And we often get papers that, as we say, exercise intellectual muscles. They show that they have read a lot, and they have a lot to say about what they have read, but it doesn't really contribute to the field. So here is where this metaphor of conversation, it becomes really important. You need to show that you are aware of the conversation that goes on. It might be several conversations in your case, and you don't need to agree with the conversation, but you need to show that you're aware of the conversation. Yeah. So there is a long history of institutional theory and whatever in organization studies. Is one of the primary journals for the development of new institutional theory. And if you're not relating to that conversation, again, you will shoot in the dark. You will propose something that might be interesting. You might want to show that you have reread Powell and DiMaggio and found new things in it. But of course, you can only say that by showing that you're aware of a long conversation that departs from Powell and DiMaggio most of the times in some way, in order to say that new institutional theory has done this or that, or opened this and that, or missed this or that. So assuming that you are alone in the desert is often wrong, and therefore not a good route to go down. We are quite generous, and this varies. Journals can have 8,000 words. We have 11,000 words. If you publish in Academy of Management Annals, it could be 20,000 words. It's 58 pages long paper, and so it's there are different traditions. And of course, you need to formally just know about that. We have 4 types. A research article can be quantitative, qualitative. Perspectives is a bit of a specific, it's as close to review article that we get. We do not publish review articles, i.e. articles that just, for example, if we stay with institutional theory, reviews the progress in institutional theory of the creation of organizations, or the role of entrepreneurship in institutional entrepreneurship. Let's pick that. So that could be a review that you do, but we do not publish that. But perspectives are often based on invited work, actually, but it can also be proposed. So you write an overview of a field, and you select 5, 6 previously published papers in organization studies as good examples of how this topic has progressed. It's like you climb up a hill using those papers, and then you have to tell us what you can see when you stand on the top of that hill, and how the field should move forward. The 2 others, or normal article perspective, and X and O as the essay style we have been talking about, and then methodology articles. We just opened for those like 1.5 years ago, so we have published some, I think, or some are close to being published, but there are papers in review process, of course, that deal with this. Description of this you find on the web page, of course, so it's just for you to read, but it's important, especially if the difference between a normal research article, X and OS essay, and method article is good to know. So as I said, qualitative, quantitative, but Organization Studies is a journal that publishes probably 80% qualitative work. So it's not the typical quant journal, although we have, of course, senior editors that are experts in that too. But it comes with perhaps the European origin, perhaps the multidisciplinary approach, the rooting in social sciences broadly, that it results in much more qualitative data than quantitative. So, thinking about publishing your work, there are a number of things, of course, that needs to be part of a good paper. The research question cannot come on page 8. It doesn't work. I know it's easy to get trapped in your own introduction, and you get inspired and you write, and but it needs to be there up front. Typically, if it's not been described on the 2nd or 3rd page, it's too late. Yeah? We cannot stretch the reader's patience that long. There are a number of things 3 things that are important in the opening of a paper. It needs to motivate the study, it needs to position the study, and it needs to clarify what is the problem. Yeah? So those 3 elements are key to getting the reader beyond the introduction, the first part, so to speak. And motivating the study is often on the basis of a problematization. Yeah, what we do not know, what is missing, what has emerged, what has happened, what is presently characterizing the world of organizations, or a discovery, or a debate. But we need to know why another paper on your topic needs to be published. And it is, of course, intimately related to positioning it. So if you want to successfully motivate why this study is needed to be published, you inevitably need to position the work. And there is where the conversation comes in, of course. Yeah. So where is it located? Is it, about social, let's stay with our previous, is it about institutional entrepreneurship, for example? So where is the present debate on institutional entrepreneurship? What has been done? What achievements are there? How do you relate to those? What are problems, or what are key concepts that you will draw on? Will you combine literature on institutional entrepreneurship with some other literature? Often you see in organization studies that, okay, institutional entrepreneurship is interesting. However, I am missing this concept from, and then comes the multidisciplinary aspect. It can be a concept from Foucault, from Baudrillard, from Bourdieu, if I just stay with the French in this case, or or it can be, yeah, institutional entrepreneurship interesting, however, but Max Weber already said in Economy and Society, and so on and so forth. So often a new juxtaposition that claims to renew institutional entrepreneurship in this case, and enable that to explain or understand a phenomena better, more precisely, so that is typically part of the motivation that positions the paper to. And then, of course, it needs to be clear what the question is, what the problem is. Of course, it has to be readable and formatted according to the guidelines and so on. And if this is not in place, it also unnecessarily irritates editors and reviewers. There are many ways to structure a paper. So one suggestion that comes here is by no means unconventional, but nevertheless useful. So if you have introduction, literature review, or extant research, and then, for example, if you draw upon that and compose a theoretical framework on the basis of the literature, that's an option. You can go into a method and explain how data was generated, but also how it will be analyzed. So methodology includes reflections on analytical strategy, how the analysis will support the aim of the study or the purpose of the study, and enable you to successfully tackle the question. There is a findings often combined with analysis in qualitative papers. So the interviews or the observations are analyzed, for example, using discourse theory or narrative perspective. And then the analysis generates the result of the study. So the discussion needs to make use of those results to develop a contribution. And when that is achieved, you can conclude on the basis of that contribution that it has implications for the field of what it is you're studying. We stay with our institutional entrepreneurship example. So you have developed a contribution to institutional entrepreneurship theory, and it's of course very convincing if you can show that it is a problem that has been discussed before. It's an obstacle, it's a dilemma, it doesn't need to be a gap, which is a popular rhetoric for motivating a study. It could just be a puzzle or a question that has not been possible to ask so far because the lack of better, more precise theory. There are many ways to be rejected, of course, but and I have quickly mentioned some before. Flaws in method doesn't really tackle the so what question well, and so on. Confirm what we already know. This has never been done. Rhetoric is often unsuccessful because it has almost always been done. And of course, it's better to bring out what the novelty of the empirical material enables you to do in terms of adding and renewing. You can renew, of course, precisely on the basis that this has been done before, and therefore it can be renewed or it can be developed, and so on. When you're stuck with your data, often get help from another pair of eyes. This is where you develop a relative blindness to your own work that we all know all too well. So the more you work with it, the less rewarding you find it. It's difficult to return to it and see something interesting, but a fresh pair of eyes is often what then is needed. So this is interesting, that is interesting, this is less so. And often that provides surprising input to how to make a stronger paper. I will not spend much time with this. It says a bit more about the particular profile of organization studies, but more finish by talking about concepts. So this is where we, so perhaps 10 more minutes, where we often find problems in the papers, and where papers predominantly on the basis of lack of a theoretical contribution, they are rejected. But it can also be that the contribution is unconvincing, unprecise, or not enough. Simply, it's too little. We get too little from the study, and a key way to think about this in terms of the terminology that we have is that we use either concepts or constructs. And you can see that there's a tendency in quantitative work to work with construct, perhaps, and in qualitative work you use the word concept. But concepts are, of course, always doing what they're doing in relationship to other concepts. That's how they sometimes form models or theories. So a number of concepts that are definitionally related in a specific way can build the basis of a theory. So it's difficult to pull a concept from its intellectual context. For example, if you use habitus concept from Bourdieu, that is doing its work in relationship to a number of other concepts in Bourdieu's sociology or sociological theory. And if you just pull out habitus and put it into another theory, it might fall quite flat and show that it is co-determined by its relationship to other concepts. So this is where the other concept of translation comes in and is important. Yeah? So if you do export a concept from philosophy or sociology or economics, you often have to be careful about what happens when it is uprooted and rerouted in a new concept. And showing lack of that is often where you get accused of not being aware of your assumptions, yeah, or being unreflexively applying a concept in a new intellectual context, yeah. And so we do see concepts as part of conversations or part of chains of other concepts most often. And so when this is weak, we typically see the editor or the reviewer asking for greater awareness of the conversation. Yeah? This is a conversation that originates in Peter Raff or in Michael Porter or in Bourdieu or whatever, and you seem unaware of where it is found, where it was launched and how it was developed. Yeah? This is, of course, something that we often face because in an interdisciplinary journal, a multidisciplinary journal like ours, you often have that as the author's project, that you read, as indeed is often the case in my case, you read philosophy, or you read anthropology, or even literature studies, and you suggest that the concept of rhizome in Deleuze, or the concept of self-discipline in Foucault, or whatever it can be, has bearing on the problem of X in organizations. And you then again have to be contextually aware of what you are doing when you do transport a concept and suggest that it relates to new concepts in new ways. Yeah. So, for example, here the concept of discourse, which of course is much older than Foucault, but for most people is associated with Foucault, has a life of its own. Yeah. So you have fantastic discussions of discourse, for example, in Descartes hundreds of years ago, but Foucault renews that, and in his conceptualization, it always relates knowledge and power in specific ways. And so if you do use discourse, it's difficult to get around Foucault, so to say. This also means that you have conceptual personas, as some call this. If you do have, the self-sufficient, self-grounded subject, epistemological subject that knows, is a concept that has Descartes as a conceptual persona. He's the one that sort of launches that and fortifies that. If you have the concept of discourse, you have Foucault as a conceptual persona. If you talk process thinking today, or processes, you would have a number of people like Whitehead and Bergson or Deleuze as conceptual personas there. So it's difficult to get around them. To write as if you were unaware of those would then be part of the problem. Yeah. So this flashes out a bit, and you're of course welcome to receive these slides. I can email them to Ivona, for example, and so you don't need to worry if I rush past things that you would like to read more carefully. So this is what I talked about, the unplugging or uprooting concepts from the network of systemic connections that they have. So there is no concept is an island, of course. They always work with their neighbors, so to speak. And they have an impact, they have a history, they have sometimes even a career of their own. They have a success initially, and then they have fallen into oblivion, and then someone reintroduces it, and this is often important. So you can think about concepts as such in various ways, but roughly they do help us think about things. Yeah, so they help us analyze and describe what goes on in the world. Some, like Deleuze and process philosophers, think that concepts are, especially for philosophers, to invent, to bring thought beyond the brim, beyond the limit of what has been possible to think. So we need concepts to all the time progress thinking, of course, and therefore it's important that when you want to make a theoretical contribution, you need to be quite careful and precise how your concepts are used and how they are related to what is already in place. If you claim, for example, a contribution, a novel contribution, or a development. Yeah. So this describes this well, I think. The movement of thought to the virtual fringe of things. This is Brian Misumi. Yeah? So if philosophy then rigs thinking to make singular connections in fictional anticipation of their actualization. That's a very condensed description of process thinking, if you're interested in that. Yeah, but concepts always help thought to anticipate how thinking could be achieved, how thinking could be done more precisely, more deeply. Some use that metaphor of depth to generate a greater sense, a better understanding of what we have analyzed. Yeah. If we can finish with this is more detail about concepts. We can finish with Roy Sotheby has written for the Academy of Management Review, for example, on the question of theoretical contribution, and there is a discussion of the synonym quality of concepts and constructs also. So constructs are conceptual abstractions of phenomena that cannot be directly observed. So this is just a way to describe what theory is. Theory is what we cannot directly observe. I can observe the impact of power, but it's difficult to observe power as such. Yeah. So power is a good concept that is theoretical in the sense that it abstracts a phenomena studied and help us say something more about that beyond what is readily observable. They are created, invented, developed for scientific purpose, for research purpose, and that purpose is part of your purpose statement. I want to explain, understand, study, analyze, diagnose the conditions of power in employment relationships, or what it can be. And they are also the foundation of theory. So theory is defined as a system of constructs or concepts. And those who work with grounded theory recognize that Glasser and Strauss use this terminology too. So they do have an idea of clustering concepts on an additional level of abstraction, and then suggest we have now theoretical compositions in play, if not a theory as such, which is a big word, of course. But if we relate concepts, they do have a theoretical message. They have an input to theory because they become systemic in that sense, that they do add to the greater theory of this or that. Now, you can talk about this too, if people do build great theories anymore, and that's an interesting discussion, of course. But and so if you say that, okay, we have a theory of bureaucracy by Max Weber, for example, but not even then you could actually identify with some great success the theory of bureaucracy. If you look into the work of Weber, it's very scattered. Not even in Economy and Society is there a so consistent development of the theory of bureaucracy, but it is described and analyzed in many places, in many ways. So one should not be discouraged by that. You know, we all, theories are more perhaps to be understood as handles for the analyst to say beyond what a layman, what the everyday person could do, say something more about how something should be understood or made sense of or explained, such that future action is supported by a greater precision of knowledge, of course. And that is far more than anyone can wish for. If we can add just a bit in that sense by nuancing a concept or slightly develop a concept, this is of course enough for certainly for publishing. Sotheby has a list, say, okay, what conceptual clarity, what does that come from? It comes from clear definitions. If you define a word, you also have to delimit the scope of that concept. So where and when does it apply? What contextual circumstances, as we have been talking about briefly. Show how it is related to other constructs or concepts. So no concept is an island, and the author needs to show great awareness of this. And this does not prevent surprising bridges to neighboring islands, or even imports from other islands to enrich the island you're on, so to speak. But awareness of this is the key. And also, of course, be reflexive in terms of coherence and logical consistency in relationship to overall arguments. So, for example, institutional theory struggled for quite some time with the concept of the entrepreneur. How could a theory of primarily stabilities, templates, roles, habits, norm structures accommodate for the entrepreneur or the entrepreneurial process that breaks that in order to make itself known to the world? So it took quite some time for that to be achieved, for institutional theory to find a way to relate to entrepreneurship. And then of course, this is the overall theoretical argument, might be this debate in institutional theory that we do not have a capacity to incorporate entrepreneurship. And that's a problem, because innovation and entrepreneurship is sort of everywhere today. So that's a good example of how you needs to be aware of that running argument. Conceptual clarity, finishing point here is more an example of how that could also be achieved in language, that we have words that we use a lot, elements, aspects, dimensions are often used in academic writing, and sometimes interchangeably and out of context, so to speak. So it's also always good to be aware of the precision when you write. I think that's what I wanted to say in terms of how to get published, with strong emphasis on making a theoretical contribution. So I'm happy to engage in a discussion with you, leaving you with this dare to know credo, which I think is very important to return to, because it can be quite daunting and quite, oh, how can I ever get published? Or this is just hard work. It is also fun, of course, and you should never submit anything that you don't think is inspiring and fun to read, nor, of course, write it. So that shows quite well when you read something where the author think this is interesting, this is fun to do, rather than it's something I have to do. And again, this life of academia should be a highly collective work, and engage people in your surrounding, or indeed globally, as readers or people who can be supporting and provide input to your work. That's key to how ideas travel and become sharpened. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation and very interesting tips and tricks, let's say like that. We do not have any comments in the chat. I would like, of course, to invite all of my colleagues that are present in this virtual session and the virtual workshop to ask you something, of course, if they have some questions, some doubts, or maybe some comments about the presentation. Anybody?
Hi all. May I ask a question, please?
Welcome. Yes.
I have a bit of a controversial question. It comes down to a simultaneous or concurrent submission. So I have heard many people, potential authors, saying that it should be allowed. Now, where do you, as a publisher, stand on that topic? I'm guessing you're strongly against that, but I would like to get an explanation why exactly. Thank you.
So you mean multiple submissions to the same journal?
To the different journals.
Oh, different journals.
Yes.
Well, it's sort of it's impossible in the sense that at some point the plagiarism software will simply alert red, and one of the processes will be stopped because no publisher in the world will publish something that plagiarizes something else. Then the lawyers will come into the room, and there's a big problem. Yeah.
Okay, can I ask a question, please?
Yep.
In one of your previous slides, you said that all the papers which are submitted to the journal should be aligned with the existing theory practice. Is that means somebody cannot do something new? It's like everything must be in order as somebody did already, but we will go just deeper in a problem. Or we can raise a new problem and have a good argument for that and work on it. Yeah,
of course. So you should, as I said, you should be aware of the conversation, and you don't need to agree with it, and you don't even need to participate in it, but you need to show awareness. So it's very difficult to argue for that you're doing something new if you don't show awareness of what is already in place. Yeah, then the reader will simply have to trust you on that. Okay, I believe you, it's new. So therefore the logic is that you need to show that there is a conversation going on, there is a dominant concept used, or there's a theoretical school or whatever. However, and then comes your argument for why we should interest ourselves in something new. And indeed, I think Organization Studies is one of those journals that have been often renewing and often publishing such work on the basis of the multidisciplinary orientation of the journal. So a lot has come from anthropology, philosophy, and of course sociology to renew Organization Studies. We will welcome that, yes. But again, it has to be well argued, so that the reader can follow you into the novelty, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there. I have a question.
Welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's a bit of an echo, but I don't know.
Okay, hold on. Just a second.
I think you have a...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay, better. I have a question for you, I guess. For instance, if I'm writing a research paper where I want to do a research based on some kind of questionnaire, would you say that it's a better quality if I use a questionnaire that has already been used by someone else, and then I refer to it, okay, this questionnaire has been used and this time, has this and this validity, reliability, or would you say it's better quality of research paper if I use my own questionnaire that I have developed and said, you know, I have done this and this research, blah, blah, blah. And I found it's a really good questionnaire construct and all of that. Just, I guess I want to see what would you think of it, since you have read so many research.
Right. So this depends on several things. If it is a so-called mature field that you are working in, and there is a series of, you could say, a series of problems that have attracted a lot of research. So, for example, for a long time, if we take entrepreneurship studies, there was a question of trait in the beginning. Who is the right entrepreneur in terms of psychological profiles? And that question generated an enormous amount of research centered on a certain number of problems. So, for example, locus of control, or need for efficacy, or need for achievement, and so on. So classical psychological work was applied. Then there was also a set of instruments developed, survey templates that had been, refined. And if you go into that kind of question, it would be natural and sometimes even advisable to use such refined instruments, because they would have greater precision and less problems. However, the second, so if you're not in such a mature field, there's no reason per se. But another condition is, of course, whether you do exploitative or explorative research in terms of your own purpose. You want to discover something. It would be not so wise to use a well-established instrument for. It would prevent you from asking new questions. So if you want to explore, there is absolutely no problem at all with you using your own questionnaire. But of course, it's also this question of how well it was built, and whether you can convince the reader that it does what it was built to do. So there is an attractive shortcut for authors to rely on an existing, well circulated instrument or survey, of course. But principally, I don't think you could say it's preferable to go in either direction, except if you know, if you work in a mature field or in a novel field, if you have an explorative or an exploitative purpose with your research. So yeah, you can hear that it's sometimes safe to go in the direction of something well established. So avoid unnecessary questions from the reviewers, because it is already tried before. But you could also, of course, if you want to discover or renew something, you can, on the other hand, also be accused of being dragged into a normalized way of thinking by using just the same questionnaire as everyone else. So how do you expect anything new to come out of that? So if you don't want to refine, but explore, that becomes your choice then to develop something new. In addition to this, people would then say, if you do want to explore and open something new, why would you use a questionnaire to start with? Yeah, so you should interview people instead and do the logic of as open questions as possible to get surprising answers, or to have them tell stories that take you into a new route that was not thought of when the instruments or the questionnaires were developed. So that's also a thing to think about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? We have some comments in the chat. So all said just thank you, Daniel. It was very interesting presentation. Thank you. It was great, very clear. So we can see that all of the participants are really satisfied with your workshop.
Oh, thank you. Very generous of you. So I have I will include as part of my slides that I sent to Ivona also a couple of pages on a well-written and a not so well-written abstract. Since this is also part of the opening of a paper, it might be useful to see. But it's quite classical by now that an abstract needs to include all the elements that are important for the opening pages of a paper, which is, I don't know if we have any classical music fans in the audience, so to speak, but I often say this is a bit like a Mozart composition. So oftentimes in Mozart, the first 1 minute, you get sort of an intense summary of the whole piece. And then the rest of the piece is slowly going into each of these figures that have been playing in the fantastic opening. And he takes a bit more time to play them out. And then it returns sort of in a moving beyond at the end. An abstract similarly positions, motivates the paper, provides the research question, and describes in a condensed form the contribution. So it's a kind of a micro paper in that sense, without being, you know, an exact mini version, obviously, but it brings the reader into the paper. Today, also, as you know, it should be searchable, so you should be able to find your particular paper when you search for these words in the abstract. Not only keywords and titles are in that sense important. Of course, you should seldom use references in the abstract. We don't need to know what publication by J. Barney or Michel Foucault that you have used in but in more narrative form, still describe the contribution of the paper. So I will include that, as it's typically, it's a bit technical, but I mean, it's an important element of successfully going beyond the editor's reasons for rejecting a paper, that it is lacking in these respects. And that's really what most of this is about. And it is also to encourage you, it is a craft in many ways. It has to be done many times. No one gets published immediately. I often hear, and with permission from Bill Gartner, some of you know Bill Gartner as an entrepreneurship scholar. He uses this himself. One of his most cited papers was rejected 8 times before it was finally entered into a review process. So think about that when you get discouraged by being rejected from not only one, but from 2 journals. That you have at least 5 more journals to go before you get to Bill's experience, and you often come to this simply submitting and revising and submit again is, of course, the best success factor for being published, and again using one's colleagues to get to that point where the paper sticks and doesn't fall out. Yeah. Okay, you're in charge, Ivona, so you're welcome to to conclude this whenever you...
Yes, of course. So we can just ask once more. Are there any other comments, maybe questions for Daniel?
One more question, please.
Okay.
So to continue on what you just said, as a new guy trying to publish, should I try to build a track record in a lesser known journals, or should I immediately start to target Q1 journals?
I think you learn more from having your paper reviewed. And of course, it is very difficult to get into a review process in top journals. So I think it's good to have a parallel strategy in that sense. I think you learn a lot from going through a review process, and that way strengthen your skills at writing papers. It's a bit like, you know, the sushi chef that has to handle the rice the first 5 years before making any sushi. One needs to get into the experience of being reviewed if you're if you're supposed to develop any skills of writing better. So if you keep submitting to top journals and get rejected and never get to read any reviews of your work, it's difficult to refine that craft. So I would suggest to do a bit of both, not to avoid top journals, because like from organization studies, you would always get a rejection letter that also argues and motivates the reject, and that's a sort of review in itself. Yeah. So you will always learn from that, but I think you learn more from having 2 or 3 review reports written about your paper, even if it in the end is rejected. But you get a good sense of how is it understood by other readers, and what is unclear to them, while it is simultaneously crystal clear to me. And that's often the negotiation that goes on in terms of refining a text towards publishable form. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have more questions? No. Okay, so we can finish. If Daniel, you think, of course, you said everything. We have just one comment also here. They are interesting for this presentation, and they are interesting for this recorded session. So I think it will be the best if the assistants or the authors or everybody that are present in this virtual room can send us an email to the DM conference mail. So info@dmdubrovnik.com. So maybe, of course, I probably know that you are familiar with this email. I can write it also in the chat. So before the end of this session, so everybody that are interested in this presentation or in this recorded session, please send us an email. So I put it in the chat.
Very good.
So thank you once again for this, I think, very useful comments and everything, because I know the name and the surname of our PhD students, and the majority of them are just beginning. So they are in the early stages in the process of getting the PhD diploma. So I think it is not going to be useful just for the preparation of the scientific papers, but also for the preparation of the their doctoral dissertation, especially this theoretical part and the explanation of how to have a critical view to the different, of course, theoretical contributions, and of course give their own contribution. So thank you really for all these interesting comments that you said to us. And of course, see you tomorrow. So tomorrow morning you have also one very important activity at the DM conference. So you are one of our keynote speakers, and see you, of course. And I hope that everything is going to be also fine like this, because tomorrow we are going with the hybrid model. So on site and online.
Yeah.
Something new for us also.
Yeah.
Challenging. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ivona, and all you others. And yeah, maybe some of you, we will see you tomorrow again then. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Thank you.
So thank you all and have a nice day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.